But I wanted to welcome you to, this is our fourth annual SCORE YBD. So this is a collaborative between three groups of people. One is the Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder, and you'll hear more about us later in the evening, along with parents and families affected by bipolar disorder who are working with us in our clinic, and together with our partners, the Mood Disorders Association of Ontario. We have about an hour and a half planned programming for tonight, and we're going to keep to that so that we have a half an hour at the end to interact with each other, to talk about research, advocacy, clinical issues, and whatever people have at top of mind as it relates to youth bipolar disorder. So without further ado, I wanted to introduce Dr. Anthony Levitt, who's chief of the Hervis Brain Sciences program at Sunnybrook, and Dr. Levitt is going to start off the evening for us.
I'm in the dark. I don't have any slides, so you can turn the house lights up. Thank you. Okay, good evening, welcome. It's great to see so many people here to learn and have an exchange about bipolar disorder. I'll start with a story which may not sound, actually a couple of stories, which may not sound like they're connected to bipolar disorder. They're not, but they illustrate a point. So in 1895, a guy by the name of Wilhelm Röntgen published an article called On the Use of a New Ray. And he didn't know what the ray was, so he called it the X-ray. X because he didn't know what it was. And he had just discovered that, on his wife's hand, by the way, that if you passed this X-ray through her hand, he could see her skeleton. And it appeared on a barium sheet. So he published this in 1895 in December. By the following November, every single major hospital in Europe had a department of radiology. And I tell you this story because when new discoveries occur that are profound and meaningful, they spread like wildfire and they change the way we do medicine and the way we treat people. So let's fast forward. In 1983, a woman by the name of Melissa Benoit was born with cystic fibrosis. And she was spent the first month of her life in the ICU. But when she was born in 1983 with cystic fibrosis, her life expectancy was 12 years. So it was anticipated in Canada someone born that year with CF would only live about 12 years. But in 1989, 6 years later, Lap Chi Su, a genetic researcher at Sick Kids, discovered the gene for cystic fibrosis. And within months, the treatment for cystic fibrosis changed, so much so that Melissa Benoit is still alive today at the age of 33, a mother of two, working as a nurse at Sick Kids. And so another example of a dramatic medical discovery, probably the greatest. It's been called the greatest genetic discovery of the modern era. It changed the way cystic fibrosis is treated and increased her lifespan and dramatically. Now, I tell that story not just because it's a rapid uptake, but Lap Chi Su came to us in 1994, 5 years after that discovery, and said to us he wanted to find the gene for bipolar disorder because he thought that was the next big genetic illness. So this giant of genetic research in 1994 said, I want to find the gene. We haven't found the gene. 2016, we still haven't found the gene. But in 1994, life expectancy of people with bipolar disorder was 10 years shorter than people without bipolar disorder. And if we had discovered that gene in 1994, we could have had many more healthy, happy years for people with bipolar disorder as we exist today. And so I think so it's disappointing. By the same token, I think we're on the verge of some dramatic discoveries in bipolar disorder. What we need people who are devoted to research and understanding bipolar disorder, not just the biology, but also the clinical management. And so we have that here at the Centre for Youth Bipolar Disorder at Sunnybrook. It is the only program of its kind in Canada, and we are very fortunate to have Dr. Goldstein in its lead. And I believe that despite the fact that we have not made that discovery since 1994, or and many others, that we're on the cusp of that. And the issue is bipolar disorder. It's a serious illness with serious complications, and it's a complicated illness. But discoveries in bipolar disorder will lead to tremendous advances, I think, not just for bipolar disorder, but for multiple medical illnesses. So I think what you're going to hear is a broad range of information about bipolar disorder, including some of the research, and you'll see on the poster some of the amazing work that's going on. I think it's very promising. I'm very enthusiastic about the discoveries. And I hope that you enjoy the evening, that you're educated, that you understand a variety of things about bipolar disorder, as well as the fact that there are still some very important discoveries yet to come. And it is my hope that sometime in the next 10 years, Dr. Goldstein will stand here and give a lecture on the new discoveries in bipolar disorder, just bipolar disorder, just as Röntgen did in 1895. So enjoy the evening, and I hope you're all educated. And I see the program looks like a fantastic program. So enjoy.
Thanks, Anthony, for those opening remarks. And we're going to move on to the agenda, which involves this group of different collaborators that I mentioned earlier. So we're going to start off hearing from the lived experience of a mother of two teenagers with bipolar disorder and a young man with bipolar disorder who are courageous and open to speaking with us this evening. After that, we're going to move on to hearing from Andrew Comp from the Mood Disorders Association of Ontario, and then you'll hear from myself and Dr. Mitchell to end off the evening. So to get us started, I wanted to call Jen and James up to share with us some of their lived perspectives and insights on bipolar disorder.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jen. I have two children, and my son James is 23, and my daughter Lauren is 20. Both of them have been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. My son was 17, and in the latter part of grade 12 when he was diagnosed, and my daughter was 16 and partway through grade 11. When they were diagnosed, I was shocked, but I wasn't surprised, because in my family and in my husband's family, mental illness is very strong. There's especially a lot of diagnosis of bipolar disorder on my husband's side. But thankfully, they were diagnosed quite early, and so a lot of the bad choices that some of the relatives had made that had lasting impact on their lives didn't happen in our family, so I'm very grateful. So tonight's theme is comorbidity, which is having two or more disorders happening at the same time. And that is very true in the case of my kids. So for example, when James was a small child, he was easygoing, happy-go-lucky kid, but he had social anxiety. He was shy, had a hard time making friends. As he grew older, especially in the early teens, he started to express depressive symptoms. He would cry, but it lasted a couple of days, and I thought, you know what, it's teenage stuff, right? Growing up, hormones. By the time he was in grade 11, he would complain of having pains in his side, his legs. He would research and think he'd have all kinds of illnesses. And so his family doctor suggested that he see a psychologist, that perhaps he had anxiety. And so the psychologist, after she interviewed him, said that she suspected he had depression and type of anxiety disorder. And so he would go weekly for sessions with her. And as the year progressed, by the time he was in grade 12, towards the end, his depression got really bad. So he couldn't go to school anymore. He would sit on the couch with his hoodie over his head. He'd cry. And he would start talking about, why am I alive? Those types of thoughts. So I brought him to the family doctor. The family doctor took him in, had a talk with him, called me in after and said, you need to take him to Sunnybrook, to the ER, and he's probably not coming home. Okay, so I brought him here. He was admitted voluntarily because he expressed that he didn't feel safe. And so he was put on an antidepressant because he was diagnosed with chronic depression. Within a couple of days, he was cured. So he was happy, seemed fine, but then he would cycle between extreme irritability, anger, rage, energy, laughter, and then crying again. And then on one Sunday, he talked about wanting to die. So we came back, and at the time in the ER, the way he was cycling, the staff thought he was high on drugs. He wasn't, so they realized that the antidepressant had started the shift in the moods. So he was admitted into the hospital. He spent about a month. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And it took about 2 years, trying different medications, different doses, to finally get it right. And so he's been pretty stable. He's been able to work part-time as a barista. He did his Bachelor of Arts degree at university, and he's going to be doing a postgrad in psychology this coming fall. So I'm really glad to see that. Then with my daughter, so they say that no two people with bipolar disorder are alike. So it's hard to diagnose, right? Well, my daughter, she was a different child. She was a content baby, slept a lot, very happy, but she had vicious temper tantrums. And so these temper tantrums would last minutes, sometimes felt like hours. And after she'd have her temper tantrums, not always, she would start laughing uncontrollably. And it always confused me. The temper tantrums continued till she was into her early teens. At school, she had separation anxiety. I had to go to school with her for 2 years, volunteer at the school because she didn't want to be alone away from her mom, which was good because I got my job at the school board. At school, the teachers would comment that she would daydream a lot, and instead of doing her work, the middle was blank and the whole around it was decorated because she loved art and drawing. And she was described as being in a daydream. So in grade 4, she was tested, and she did not have a learning disability, but she came out requiring more time for processing. And so modifications were made to her education that way. When she went into high school, she went into an arts program because she was very creative and very talented, and continued to struggle with social anxiety, shyness, self-esteem issues. By the time she was in grade 11, the anxiety got really bad. She was having panic attacks, she was fainting, she was scared to go have a shower if nobody was home because she had passed out in the bathroom once. And so it got to the point where she wasn't eating much, she stopped going to school, and then she was crying and spending a lot of time in her room. Her drawings were dark, her music, her taste was depressive. And so at that point, after trying unsuccessfully to get her to go see a psychiatrist, a doctor, anybody, I said I'd have to call 911 if she wasn't going to come because it was getting pretty serious. And so her brother stepped in, had a nice talk with her. We were able to see James psychiatrist, Dr. Ryder, right away. She put her on an antidepressant, warning me that because of the history, not to be surprised if she would go into manic episode. I knew what to look for, and within 2-3 days, same thing, miraculously cured. But with her, she was euphorically happy, hilarious, made us laugh all the time. All of a sudden, she was quick, her thoughts were on point, talking a mile a minute, full of energy, and then the crash came, the crying. So we brought her back, and Dr. Ryder referred her to Dr. Goldstein, and that's where she was diagnosed as also having bipolar disorder. So it took about a year and a half to get her meds kind of figured out. And so she's been, about a year and a half later. Since then, she's been another year and a half pretty stable. She's finishing a program in college, early childhood education, and she has a job waiting for her for when she's done next month. So it's been pretty good as well. So, going through these experiences are not easy. I remember a friend telling me, this is going to make their life harder, but it's not a death sentence. And she's right, it's not. So I'm very proud of them for what they've been able to accomplish despite the challenges, the struggles. It's made them stronger people, resilient, more empathetic, loving human beings. And my advice as a parent is to try very hard to take one day at a time. Sometimes it's an hour at a time, sometimes a minute at a time, especially when you're in crisis. It's not easy. Don't personalize what your kids say or do. They're different. They are different from the illness they have. They have bipolar disorder. They are not bipolar. Talk openly and freely with your children about the disorder. Talk to other family members about it. Help eliminate the stigma. Encourage your children to speak about it with others. My children do, and they've been able to help others who've had their own struggles with other mental health issues. Try to stick to a routine, but be flexible, because with bipolar disorder, things are unpredictable. Learn as much as you can about the illness and what you can do to support the loved one. Learn how it affects others in the family, and most importantly, take care of yourself in the process. Join a support group like the MDAO at the back. And also, in my case, what's helped me is to have a sense of humor, because during the rough times, if you're not laughing, you're crying. Thanks.
Okay, so probably no one will be able to tell you really how a person who has bipolar feels rather than a person who has it themselves. Luckily, I'm one of the people who has gone from it and surpassed it and is able to, lead some sort of stable life today. Now, people don't always deal with the mental illness like I did. From a young age, probably before I was even 10, I noticed that, I'd go through these moods. I'd just feel like crying. I'd feel like garbage. I'd feel worthless. But I didn't know why. So I'd have these extreme happiness, this energy, but there wasn't a reason. Nothing triggered it. Or my bouts of crying. Nothing would trigger it. And these bouts just got worse and worse as time went on. And of course, as you go through your adolescent years, things just get more aggravated. So when you go through these intense sides of depression, it's not so much, for me at least, it wasn't triggered by anything. It was just you felt like garbage that day and you were just going to sit in your basement and cry for hours. So the worst part about this, and I don't know if this is the case for everybody, but the fact that you don't know what is causing it makes you even more depressed. So sometimes I would cry and cry and cry and just find a reason why I was crying and then let out my emotion by that way. But it made no sense to me, and that frustration led me to more suicidal thoughts because I didn't fully understand. I knew there wasn't something right with me. I didn't feel things to an intense level for a reason. So from a young age, I was very observant. I noticed that a lot of people on my dad's side of the family, they had bipolar disorder. So I feared for becoming what they became. All the actions that they did, the mistakes that they made when they were older. So from a young age, I looked into the illness myself and decided to, connect. Is this in line with my thoughts, Do I see this type of mood trend? Growing older, I looked into it even more, and I remember approaching my mom even at one point saying, I think I have bipolar disorder. I don't know why I have these extreme low moods that have no reason. Like, it's so frustrating. Like, I even expressed ways I was going to kill myself just because you don't know what is happening to you. So being able to study more as I went on, I remember I did a project even in grade 10 on bipolar disorder, even looking into celebrities who had it. Now it's become a lot less of a taboo thing. You have a lot of celebrities who have come forward recently. But even then, there's still a stigma around it. And when you tell people that you have bipolar disorder, and if they come from a background where nobody has a serious mental illness in their family, they look at you like, they think you're this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type thing, where, you switch from a super high mood to like aggressive, or super depressed. And it's not like that. You basically have moods that you have no control over. but they don't happen necessarily in rapid cycling. But you do have moods like everybody else, but to a more intense level. And dealing with it is what makes the biggest difference in success for people. So for me, when it came down to going through a deep depression in grade 12 during my final year, I knew I needed help and I wanted a solution for the depression. No matter how garbage I felt, no matter how worthless I felt, no matter how much I felt like killing myself, ultimately, I just wanted to have a solution, some sort of person to find out what was wrong with me. And I didn't really want to end it. I wanted to have a solution. So I approached my mom, and we did end up going to the doctor. I went to a psychologist. I kind of struggled with that because I felt like I was there and I was talking about these issues, but the issues that I was talking about wasn't the basis for my diagnosis. You know, talking out these issues of your childhood are not going to change the fact that you've got a biological mood disorder. So going through the whole process, though it being frustrating and going to crazy extremes, like almost running out of the ER just to pretend like I was normal so I can kill myself. So many things have happened to me, but the outstanding part is that you need to be proactive about it. You need to educate yourself on your diagnosis, educate your family as well, because they probably have no clue as well, and they will treat you in a way that maybe seems degrading to you, because you are just as competent as everybody else, but you need to put yourself together and be proactive about seeking treatment. And with my sister, based on what I went through, I knew that she wasn't the same way in analyzing her own thinking and being proactive. So when it came down to her going through a great deep depression, just crying in her room, there was nobody else who could speak to her. My parents tried speaking to her, you know, they tried to comfort her, and I'm like, no, you know, just leave. I will talk to her. So when I went through those exact same depressive thoughts, you know, the illness itself, the symptoms are the same across the board. You're still going to have those same feelings of suicide, of worthlessness, like the world would be a better place if you weren't there. You're going to feel like, you know, there really is no future in you. And just all those feelings, being able to recite her exact thoughts to her at that moment made her break down even more and realize that I did know what I was talking about, and that's what led her to come to the doctor. So speaking to people who have been through that and know the exact thoughts that are going through their head is probably what's the most vital in successfully getting people to seek treatment. So the more that is communicated in terms of experience and what people go through is probably what's going to help more people to reach out for treatment for bipolar disorder. So hopefully this session will be of great education to everybody. And yeah, that's all I have to say.
So thank you, Jen and James. That was really interesting and moving, and I think educational also, because in sharing your personal stories, you also did a lot of work for us in explaining exactly what bipolar disorder is and how it travels, and I thank you for the courage to come up and to share with us candidly and openly your own family's experience. So thank you. So moving on to the next presentation, I wanted to introduce you to Andrew Compt, who I'm going to ask to come up now. And Andrew works with the Mood Disorders Association of Ontario. And I just wanted to tell you how it came to be that we are collaborating on research. The first year that we had the thought of including and inviting the Mood Disorders Association of Ontario to work with us on this, there was questions that came up in our first meetings about, you know, do people with mood disorders and families affected by mood disorders want to have research? Do they feel that this is an invasion of privacy? Do they feel this is a thing that's important? And what I said to Anne-Marie MacDonald at the time was, why don't we ask your stakeholders, your constituents, what they think? And so she was, to her credit, she was open to that, and we created a 4 or 5 question survey, and the results that came back were very surprising to the MDAO, which is to say that the vast majority, above 70% of their constituents, were interested in research and felt that there was some hope for them through research. So it's this that brings us together with Andrew. who serves as the research consultant from the MDAO, and what he's going to speak about this evening is perspectives on research from those with lived experiences of mood disorder. So thank you, Andrew.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name's Andrew. So yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about research. So the first slide I wanted to show you was what some people sort of perceive about what research is all about. Graphs, pie charts, p-values. But I thought I'd start off with a little bit of a story. I have a bit of a long history with Sunnybrook. Probably about 30 years ago, when I was in my teens, I was actually a research participant in seasonal allergy study. So that was sort of my first step into the whole research world. After that, I ended up getting a part-time job in a very in a very sort of special position that was highly exclusive. I ended up working in the housekeeping department here at Sunnybrook. So I was the guy that emptied out garbage cans and cleaned the floors and waxed the floors. But this was actually quite the great job because I was still in high school. I was just starting university, and I was able to make enough money to pay for my tuition at pharmacy school at U of T. So I rolled into pharmacy school, and during that time, I studied pharmacy, and some of my clinical placements happened here at Sunnybrook. So I kind of went from the guy that was picking up your garbage to all of a sudden the guy that was in a white lab coat. So that's some of my experience here at Sunnybrook. Then went on to working at Sick Kids with my internship, and then finally into industry in clinical research. At that point in time, everything was going quite well for me, but I had a big, deep, dark secret. I was really, really struggling a lot with my own depression and anxiety issues. I didn't want to talk about it. I hid it from everyone. And eventually, everything just kind of melted. I just had a huge meltdown. I quit my job. I completely isolated myself from everyone. And it was at that point in time that I finally sought some help, thanks to the support of my family and friends. And I got some treatment at St. Mike's. And eventually, on one very cold, rainy day, I wanted something a little bit more just besides the health care that I was getting provided at St. Mike's, and ended up at the doors of the Mood Disorders Association of Ontario. It was the first time there where I actually felt comfortable actually talking about what I was going through with other people, because I was too ashamed and too guilty thinking I had all of these opportunities, yet I wasn't able to get help for myself. Healthcare professionals are often some of the worst patients because we don't want to seek help for ourselves. But it was at the Mood Disorders Association where I was actually able to hear from other people that were going through the exact same thing. I didn't really have to explain things to other people, and people understood. People kind of got the fact that you could barely roll out of bed just to brush your teeth. So that was sort of my first experience with the Mood Disorders Association, and I'm here now. So I thought I'd just quickly go over a little bit about the vision of the Mood Disorders Association of Ontario. So we like to help individuals, and especially their families, affected by mood disorders to recover and heal. And our big motto at MDAO is to talk to someone who's been there, because much like our lived experience speakers talked about earlier, that is so key to be able to speak to other people that have been going through similar experiences. So part of our mission, just briefly, are our recovery and support programs. So we like to help individuals and families affected by mood disorders by providing a number of innovative, high-quality supports and programs. We also very much like to increase awareness around mood disorders and outreach to different communities throughout Ontario. That really helps to get people to start talking and helps to decrease stigma around mental health. And finally, one of the big parts of our mission is the idea around knowledge, to be able to contribute to knowledge of the effectiveness of recovery supports and programs through evaluation. So as Dr. Goldstein was talking about, A couple of years ago, we did a short survey, a needs assessment, through looking at some of our participants to see whether they would be interested in getting more involved in research. And as Dr. Goldstein was saying, a lot of us felt that a lot of people might be very hesitant getting involved with research, but surprisingly, we found a resounding yes, that lots of folks really wanted to become more involved in the entire research process and collaborate with many of our healthcare professionals and our research teams throughout the community. So just a quick overview of what that assessment was about. We were doing an overall needs assessment looking at different priority areas. And as I was mentioning, the majority of the members really believed that research was very important and that we should become more involved. So what that led to is the development of what we call the MRAC Committee, which is the MDAO Research and Advisory Committee. So this committee comprises 8 folks throughout the province of Ontario with a variety of backgrounds, both individuals and also family members that have someone living with a mood disorder or mental health issues. So we have people from small towns through larger towns. We have representation from the LGBTQ community, from Indigenous communities. And what they're tasked with is to advise and provide a consumer or lived experience perspective on the types of programs and research that we will become involved with at the MDAO. Also, they review and provide a peer-based perspective with senior management on the types of organizations that we will collaborate with, and also to help communicate those research findings to make the information more relevant and accessible. So from a knowledge translation perspective, it's fine if you publish all of your fancy graphs and charts in a research journal, but if folks don't really understand what that information is about, it's kind of useless. So we wanted to build those collaborations in order to get all of that information and all of that exciting research out to our program participants. So from that came a project around our Laughing Like Crazy program. Is anybody familiar with the Laughing Like Crazy program at the MDO? So I'll give you a quick little overview. It's basically a 16-week peer support and recovery program where folks living with mood disorders are actually trained over 16 weeks to talk about their mental health experiences and be able to present that in sort of a humorous way. It's been a highly successful program. We've been doing it for over 10 years. And what we did was we conducted a formal research project in conjunction with the University Health Network and Dr. Sagar Parikh and Dr. Lisa Hawk. And we found some really positive results from that program. There was improved symptom management, personal development, a sense of achievement, a sense of community, and they were able to achieve some of their personal goals that they had set out at the very beginning of the program. From that, what we were able to do is we were able to present that research at the International Society of Bipolar Disorder conference. And it's a very highly prestigious scientific conference looking at bipolar disorder. And not only were we able to present that information, but Anne-Marie McDonald, our executive director, and I were on a experts by experience committee with the ISBD. And what we were able to do is, generally at a scientific conference, you will have different tracks of interest in the scientific community. So some might be talking about the clinical research aspects, some might be talking about the basic research lab types of things, but we actually were able to include an experts by experience track where those people that were involved in research were able to present their information in collaboration with other scientists and other clinicians. And this was all integrated throughout and woven throughout the entire conference for those 4 days. So it was a great opportunity for folks actually living with bipolar to actually attend this conference. We were able to secure 50 free scholarships for folks to actually attend this conference. And it was all intermingled. You didn't know who was a clinician necessarily or who was living with bipolar disorder. So that was a great experience for us being involved in that. an example of how folks with lived experience in living with bipolar disorder can be sort of integrated within the research process. One of our big partners is right here with Sunnybrook. And what we did just this past month with the help of Dr. Goldstein and Danielle, somewhere back there, is we were able to arrange an entire month where Dr. Goldstein's research staff were able to come to the MDO and talk to a lot of our program participants. This was a really wonderful opportunity to talk about some of the exciting research that was happening at Sunnybrook, and also for folks just to learn more about what research is all about. What does that entail? Privacy, confidentiality, consent forms, what are some of the new groundbreaking areas of bipolar research? So it was an incredible opportunity for us to collaborate and to share. With that, we directly engaged with 70 participants during this month, with the Sunnybrook folks dropping by to different peer support drop-in groups that we have, and also giving little sort of chats and answering questions. And we had quite a few sign up for their newsletter. So some of the other things Sunnybrook and the MDO do are we have shared goals and visions ultimately to connect those living with mental health issues to help heal and recover. And we also have quite a strong relationship with the Family Navigation Project, where we help to provide system navigation for those families seeking support between the ages of 13 and 26. Because we all know how difficult it is to sort of navigate the system. It's incredibly confusing. Even if you do, I've had some personal medical issues where I had to actually be a patient, and it was just a horrible experience. Even though I've worked in hospitals, I've worked in healthcare, just sort of going through the rigmarole of all of that was very confusing sometimes for patients and families. So we're here to help them help navigate the system. Another one of our research collaborators is CREST BD, and they do some very interesting research around psychosocial issues in bipolar disorder. And what's great about them is not only are there academics and clinicians involved in the research, but they actually have peer researchers. So those living with bipolar disorder very much involved in the actual implementation, the design, and the process around conducting research around bipolar disorder. And one of the great things that they came out with from that research was the development of a specific bipolar quality of life assessment tool. And you can find out more information from them. It's a really great website called bdqualityoflife.com. And it gives you the ability to sort of assess specific quality of life domains that are specific to bipolar disorder, and provides you with lots of guidance in videos and very sort of interactive features that those living with bipolar disorder were actually directly involved in researching and developing. We also work with the CanBIND project, which is funded by the Ontario Brain Institute. And in this group, they're looking specifically at biomarkers around depression. And basically what that means is things like blood tests, brain scans, trying to find the specific markers that might lead to better and quicker treatment around depression, so that folks aren't experimenting sort of as much with different types of medications. So by being able to identify specific biomarkers, they are able to treat patients more effectively with less side effects and more quickly. So our involvement with that is we are actually part of a 12-member patient and family advisory committee consisting, again, of folks living with depression and also their family members. And we actually have a direct seat at the table with the researchers and the clinicians. We are invited to all of their scientific meetings. They are presenting research results with them, and we're able to sort of provide feedback in terms of what research is important to folks living with depression and what may or may not be working, how to do things sometimes in a better way that would be more effective and potentially more relevant to folks living with depression. So I thought I'd just sum up quickly, why is patient-oriented research important? It basically makes our lives better by being able to become involved in clinical research. It can help both with the methodology and the outcomes of the research. And patients are able to help in the design, the implementation, evaluation, and presenting that information to other folks that are living with mood disorders in a way that is understandable to them. And hopefully this involvement of having folks become involved in research leads to more effective studies and more effective treatment, increased credibility because the folks that are actually living with depression or different types of mood disorders or bipolar disorder were actually involved from the ground up in terms of defining what that research might be like. And sometimes it may be a more cost-effective means of conducting research. So I'm just going to end my talk with just a quick little slide from the CIHR, which is the Canadian Institute of Health Research. And they basically talk about the strategy for patient-oriented research, getting patients more involved in the entire research process and teaching patients what research is really all about and getting them increasingly involved in the entire research process, not sort of as token folks that have a mood disorder or with bipolar disorder, but giving them a real voice in the entire research in their entire research process and helping to define what the priorities are in research for future directions. And my final slide is not one of a graph, but it's just, to me, research is all about people, because ultimately we just all want to be well and live happy, joyful lives. And I think research will help folks like all of us sitting in this room, rather than just graphs and charts and whatnot, but we could have a very important role in defining what research is all about and playing an integral role in the outcomes of research. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for both your personal comments and candid reflections, and also for the guided tour of the research activities of the MDAO. It's been really a pleasure collaborating with the MDAO over the past 4 years. And what I just want to take a moment to say that as it relates to the relationship between researchers, clinicians, and families and consumer advocates, there's really excellent examples in areas like cancer, stroke, heart disease, and also increasingly and more recently autism spectrum disorders. And we've been a little bit slower to get started in the area of mood disorders, but I think we're really, we have a pace and we're catching up. So thank you very much for joining us tonight and for your ongoing collaboration, which is a lot of fun. So with that, I wanted to introduce everybody. We're going to shift to 2 presentations from myself and from Dr. Rachel Mitchell. And as you heard from Jen earlier, the theme of tonight is Beyond Mood, the importance of co-occurring problems in adolescent bipolar disorder. You heard from the family perspective what it's like to see somebody go through various different areas of psychological symptoms before landing a bipolar disorder. And that is very typical. And what we want to focus on this evening is demystifying that overlap, demystifying that complexity, and floating some specific themes that are currently timely in terms of how do you distinguish a bipolar disorder from a different condition? Do you always have to make the distinction, or can they co-occur? And for these next 2 talks, that's what we're going to be focusing on. So with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Mitchell, who I've known for the past 7 years. Come on up, and who's going to be joining us as a attending psychiatrist at the Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder effective April. So both welcome her and congratulate her with me.
So thank you for the introduction, Dr. Goldstein. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And it's a really important topic that we're going to be discussing, because certainly with bipolar disorder, co-occurring problems are the rule and not the exception. And this particular talk that this particular topic is going to focus on disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, which is, or DMDD, which I'll call it, which is a new diagnosis in the DSM-5. And it's a particularly tricky one, and so let's hope that by the end of this presentation we'll now navigate through the confusion somewhat. And that my hope is that by the end of the talk today, you'll have better, clearer answers to these three questions. And these are, what is DMDD? What is the history of DMDD? And why DMDD matters for teens with bipolar disorder. So to answer the first question, what is DMDD? So DMDD is a new diagnosis in the DSM-5, but it's not a new condition. The hallmark of DMDD is chronic irritability and severe temper outbursts. And these two problems are of the most distressing and of the most common presentations to child psychiatry in general. And I'll explain more about the history in the next slide. But first, let's just review the criteria for DMDD as is written in the DSM-5. The first criteria is that it's severe recurrent temper outbursts. These are disproportionate to the provocation, and they're recurrent. These are not your run-of-the-mill temper tantrums. They are volcanic. They can potentially be characterized by physical aggression and also by destruction of property. The second point is that they're inconsistent with the developmental level of the individual. So these are not 2-year-olds having appropriate temper tantrums. These are older children that are displaying temper outbursts that are inconsistent with their developmental level. The third thing, criteria C, is that these are temper outbursts that occur frequently, on average 3 times per week. So these are not children that have a one-off explosive reaction to one provocation. This is a chronic problem. And the fourth criteria is that the mood in between these outbursts is irritable. Now you might be thinking, well, all children are irritable. If they're hungry or if they're tired, they're irritable. If a teenager is asked to do something by their parents that they don't want to do, they're irritable. But this is the kind of irritability that doesn't have an off switch. It's pervasive and it's severe and it affects all aspects of their life, which leads me to the next point, which is that it has to have lasted for 12 months. It occurs in 2 of 3 settings, so it's not isolated to school or to home. It's not just in the context of a sibling relationship, for example, or a parental relationship. It happens in more than one setting. It's diagnosed between the ages of 6 and 18 years. So important to know that it's not diagnosed in preschool children or in young adults of university age. The onset, however, has occurred before the age of 10. So if these problems are happening for the first time in, for example, a 12-year-old, well, then that's not DMDD. That's a different disorder. And just as important about what is DMDD, it's about what is not DMDD. Now, DMDD, according to the DSM-5, is not bipolar disorder. And in fact, mania and hypomania is part of the exclusion criteria. So why am I standing up here tonight talking to you about a comorbidity that can't, by definition, exist in the DSM-5, or it can't, by definition, exist with bipolar disorder on a night that we're talking about problems that co-occur with bipolar disorder? Well, the answer is because it's not that simple. And we'll talk more about that later. And then the final criteria is, again, about what it's not. It's not irritability that is a symptom across other diagnoses, better explained, rather, by other diagnoses. So it's not better explained by depression or ADHD or PTSD. All of these disorders have irritability as a strong component of their presentation. For example, it's ubiquitous across lots of different disorders. But in this particular situation, it's not better explained by these disorders. And this line here essentially is there to illustrate that the top 4 symptoms, A, B, C, and D, really are an attempt to describe children and adolescents with this cluster of symptoms. And then the bottom is more the criteria or the certain bullet points that they must meet in addition to the above 4. And so what we call that is the phenotype, or what it looks like, what the disorder actually looks like. And that's important only because much of the research that has been done centers on those 4 characteristics rather than the bottom part. So what is the history of DMDD? Where did it come from? It really arose out of the effort to eliminate misdiagnosis of bipolar disorder and as such, overdiagnosis, or what was observed to be overdiagnosis of bipolar disorder. So that is, chronic irritability in mostly younger children was starting to be wrongly diagnosed as bipolar disorder. So, and that increase began to happen in the late 1990s, and that's basically because of a different conceptualization of bipolar disorder that started to emerge. And in the early 2000s, essentially, there was a roundtable discussion that happened at the National Institute of Mental Health. And from this discussion emerged the idea of severe mood dysregulation disorder. That is, chronic irritability and temper outbursts and hyperarousal symptoms that are very suggestive, or that very much mimic, rather, ADHD. And essentially, from that disorder, there was much research that was conducted and a lot of debates and a lot of discussion. And out of that, what came was ultimately DMDD. And that was what the final diagnosis that entered into the 2013 DSM-5. Now, what DMDD didn't have was the hyperarousal symptoms that SMD had. And essentially, the reason why is because they thought that it was better explained by ADHD. So ADHD is highly comorbid with DMDD, with SMD, and with bipolar disorder. And then we also have oppositional defiant disorder. Now, oppositional defiant disorder is still a diagnosis in the DSM-5, but I point out that if you have DMDD and you meet criteria for oppositional defiant disorder, DMDD is actually the diagnosis that trumps ODD. And the reason why that's important will come up later on. But really what emerged from this is a strong effort to prevent the misdiagnosis of bipolar disorder. And so the question from that becomes, well, are these mood dysregulation disorders part of the spectrum of bipolar, or are they their own separate disorder in and of themselves? And that's really just a conceptualization. So is DMDD and bipolar disorder mutually exclusive, or can they in fact overlap? So DSM-5 says, well, they can actually overlap. But can they, is the question. And so the question is, what percentage of youth with bipolar disorder also have DMDD? Well, two studies give us information about this. The first one was by Axelson and colleagues, and they looked at a group of outpatients pre-selected for elevated symptoms of mania. And what they found is that over time, 44% of those that developed bipolar disorder from this pre-selected group of BD1 and BD2, so type 1 and type 2, 44% met actually those 4 DMDD criteria that I was talking about earlier, the phenotype, so to speak, of DMDD. Now, I should mention that this study, in addition to the other one next to it, have retrofitted DMDD criteria, meaning they had already studied a sample using oppositional defiant disorder, and they used that criteria and applied it to DMDD because they were so similar. So this was not first research done in DMDD. So that's important to understand. And the second is that in bipolar offspring, so offspring of parents with bipolar disorder, of the 33 of that sample that had bipolar disorder, 30% of them also met that DMDD phenotype of chronic irritability and temper outbursts. So the point being that DMDD is in fact common among children with and at familial risk for bipolar disorder. So you can have the DMDD symptoms and you can have discrete mania, and that's certainly what the research has shown in these clinical samples. We then looked at it in our sample here at the CYBD. And this is a figure directly from the publication. And at the bottom of the pyramid, you can see that the total sample was 108. And these are children and adolescents with bipolar disorder. Rather, I should say these are adolescents with bipolar disorder, because here at CYBD, it's 14 and up, generally speaking. So in this sample of 108, as you apply those criteria that I showed you in the first slide, essentially the rate of DMDD decreases over time. So of the 108, 27 had met that criteria for DMDD. That is, again, chronic irritability and temper outbursts inconsistent with the developmental level, and that is recurrent. Here, we took it a step further and applied more criteria to be most in keeping with the DSM-5. And we found that we went as far as the age of diagnosis between the ages of 6 and 18. And we stopped at the age of onset. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, but essentially what we wanted to look at was if there was, if 25% of the sample had this DMDD criteria, meaning they had that phenotype, and they had bipolar disorder, was there something unique about this subset of youth? And so we looked at those youth a little further. And we found that DMDD was not explained by bipolar subtype, meaning if you had bipolar 1, bipolar 2, or BDNOS, you weren't more likely necessarily to have DMDD. That was spread equally across all three groups. You weren't more likely to have familial BD, meaning bipolar disorder in the family. This is in contrary, or this is somewhat inconsistent with Sparks and colleagues. But in our sample, we also found that there were very high rates of ADHD, of 63%. And in fact, in analysis that controlled for lots of variables that were equal, that could have predicted DMDD, we found that ADHD was you were 3 times more likely to have DMDD if you had ADHD. And not surprisingly, of the sample that had DMDD, 100% also met criteria for ODD, which raises the question, well, what utility does DMDD bring then? But those are mostly academic findings. What does it actually mean clinically in terms of living day to day with DMDD and bipolar in terms of the phenotype? Well, it means that you have more functional impairment. It means you have more conflict at home. And it means that you have high rates of suicidal behavior. Now, the high rates of suicidal behavior weren't higher than those without DMDD in our sample, for example, but they were nevertheless high and were in the range of between 50 and 60%. And despite all this, despite being more impaired and high risk, they still got less treatment, meaning they had less history of medication use and less history and less likely to have been hospitalized. And the reasons for this we could speculate, but are unclear. We can talk about that more in the question period. So leading to treatment, how is DMDD treated? So the first thing to understand is that DMDD in the context of bipolar has not been studied at all in terms of treatment. The second thing to understand is that DMDD by itself has not been studied in terms of treatment, and that all the data that we have is from the oppositional defiant disorder population. So this slide is extrapolated entirely from literature on that disorder. But the practice parameters are nevertheless very helpful because the cluster of symptoms is almost identical. And that is, when you have this cluster of symptoms, you need a multimodal, multi-targeted, extensive approach that is usually intensive in its quality and extensive in its duration. You need an individualized treatment plan, so one size does not fit all. And you need to address comorbidity, which Dr. Goldstein, I'm sure, will get into in detail later. And that there are evidence-based psychosocial treatments, and actually those are the first line. So, and there are at least 5 or 6 psychosocial treatments. There are answers. There are things. There are treatments that can be useful and that can help the severing nature of this constellation of symptoms. And what makes all these different treatments similar is that they're all rooted in behavioral principles, problem-solving skills, anger management, and building the relationship between parent and child. And really, the other take-home point from this slide is that pharmacotherapy is an adjunct according to these guidelines. And the strongest evidence comes for stimulants for comorbid ADHD, but we don't have answers for, it hasn't been studied in ODD without ADHD. So it's only been studied, stimulants have only been studied in the context of ADHD. So that's also important to note. But nevertheless, in the context of bipolar disorder, most of the time, not always, but most of the time, they will be on a medication. And there is some evidence for some of these medications that are also used for bipolar disorder can help with the aggression that happens with DMDD. So why does DMDD matter to teens with bipolar disorder? So for some, the relationship could very well be like a caterpillar and a butterfly. The DMDD really is the precursor to bipolar disorder, and that may be the case for some, and that they are mutually exclusive, and then when you get one, when you get bipolar disorder, or when you get the diagnosis of bipolar disorder, that the DMDD goes away. That may be true. And it may be true that, and it's very likely true that you can get the diagnosis of bipolar disorder without having the precursor of DMDD. We don't know. The evidence is not clear, and it's messy for a lot of reasons. But the fact of the matter is that maybe it doesn't matter, because if you have DMDD and you don't look for bipolar disorder, then you're doing yourself a disservice. And if you have bipolar disorder and you don't look for DMDD, then you're doing yourself a disservice. And that's really what matters, is that the chronic irritability and severe angry outbursts, however you want to call it, can exist with bipolar disorder. That constellation can happen. And if it does happen altogether, you have more functional impairment and more conflict. And really what we need are accurate diagnosis and targeted treatment. So to summarize, temper outbursts are not mania. Chronic irritability and temper outbursts, whatever you want to call it, can co-occur with discrete mania in a subset of youth. And this subset of youth are different because they have more impairment and more conflict. And it's not necessarily explained by bipolar disorder subtype or by a history of or by family history of bipolar. And really the bottom line is it's important to look for and to treat both. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rachel. So I think what we'll do is if anybody has any questions of clarification, one or two questions of clarification, we can take those. If not, we'll move along and have questions happen informally in the discussion period afterwards. Anybody looking to clarify something from Dr. Mitchell's talk, or is crystal clear to this group? Okay, thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Okay. So for the last presentation of the evening, my topic is embracing complexity in the diagnosis and treatment of youth bipolar disorder. My experience clinically over the past decade and more in this area is that sometimes we try to oversimplify things and we try to have to choose one thing or another. And what we really have to do is embrace the fact that people don't walk through our doors simple. They walk through our doors unique and individual and often complex. My hope is that in the years ahead that we start seeing people earlier, treating them earlier, and not having some of the phenomena that I'll show you briefly that's reflected by multiple co-occurring conditions. What you heard from the beginning of this evening until this point is the fact that this is not a fabrication. This is something that people experience in their real lives, that they face multiple different problem areas, sometimes sequentially and often concurrently. Just to start off with a little bit to tell you what our center is about. So the Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder was established on the strength of anonymous philanthropic support from a community donor in 2009. We're a tertiary subspecialty clinic, which means that other child psychiatrists send adolescent patients to us for diagnostic confirmation or for management, because we deal exclusively with teens and exclusively with teens who have bipolar disorder or a parent with bipolar disorder. This gives us a certain volume of exposure that gives us a little bit more experience, which I think multiple areas of medicine would show offer some advantages. We have a mission to improve outcomes for teenagers with bipolar disorder, I would argue also with their families, through cutting-edge research, treatment, education, and advocacy. And I hope that you see later on in the evening by milling about that we're really trying to keep the breadth of that portfolio and not just be exclusively treatment providers, not exclusively be community advocates, not exclusively be researchers, but bring those together, as Andrew mentioned very poignantly, in a meaningful way so that we have research informed by clinical care, by patient and family perspectives, and keeping it real, for lack of a better term. Our research focuses on biomarkers. You heard about that from the CanBind project, essentially trying to find something that augments the modern reality, which is the diagnosis and assessment of mood disorders and bipolar disorder, other psychiatric conditions. Right now is exclusively based on observing patients and hearing from them and their relatives about their experiences, and we really don't have anything objective, which puts a lot of constraints on us. We don't think that biomarkers will replace the human encounter, but we would like it to help out with that encounter and add to that encounter. Treatment is based on assessment, trying to find the right balance. We don't believe in or against bipolar disorder. We believe that we're trying to find the right diagnosis for the right person, and we don't really get into too much debate about over or underdiagnosis because those are really population-based questions. What we have to deal with as clinicians is, does this person sitting in front of me today have bipolar disorder or not? And that's still an individual question. And then finally, and I think in the more recent years we've been focusing on education and advocacy, I wholeheartedly agree that if we just publish in scientific journals, we're really missing the mark, because I don't think you're going to destigmatize, because I'm not sure how many folks in the room read scientific journals, but you'd be not representative of the Canadian population if you did, and there's other ways that we really have to get this information across. So we're committed to all of these parts, and we hope in years ahead to see you and have you involved in one or another of these aspects of our mission. Okay. Symptoms of mania. I couldn't do a better job than Jen or James of describing exactly the spirit behind the diagnosis of bipolar disorder, which is that this is an illness characterized by episodes, almost always alternating between mania or a milder version called hypomania and depression, but some people only have mania or hypomania. You heard about the symptoms of depression directly. This is from the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition. This is essentially the current gold standard of how we reach diagnoses. It's limited, it's imperfect, but it's better than people randomly coming up with their own opinions so that nobody can talk to each other in a meaningful way. So it really serves to keep us all on the same page, and I think we should embrace that aspect of its value. So an episode of mania or hypomania is a distinct period of abnormally and persistently elevated, expansive, meaning too much enthusiasm about not much, or irritable mood accompanied with increased activity or energy. So that's the episode, and it should characterize a shift from that person's normal reaction in that type of situation. We don't pretend with this diagnostic book to say that a certain level of enthusiasm is right or wrong for society, but when individuals have discrete changes, and when those changes are accompanied by multiple of these other symptoms, that's when we begin to look at carefully the diagnosis of a bipolar disorder, of a medical condition. So it's okay to be happy, and it's okay to be really enthusiastic, but when you're doing that for weeks in a way that's out of proportion, that's causing concern from others, that's making you do risky things or stop sleeping, that's where we start looking at a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. So this is to provide, I think, we can't cover everything in this evening. I think there's a lot of clinical topics folks will leave hoping we had covered. My hope is that through the years we get to everything and come back to everything, but this gives us a little bit of a context that this is an episodic mood disorder, highly contrasting what you heard about from Dr. Mitchell, which is a chronic and always persistent and always present irritability, and the concept of DMDD. How big a problem is this? Is this a North American problem? It's a huge problem. It's the 4th leading cause of disability, functional impairment combined with missed days of school and suffering and other proxy measures of disability. And this is true worldwide. And you can see 2 of the 3 other conditions ahead are also psychiatric. What about in Canada? So you saw data from Dr. Mitchell based on people presenting to our clinic. And there are people that would say, well, that's not the representative group. Those are maybe more severe. That's why their parents brought them. So let's look at a population study where people are interviewed irrespective of whether they're seeking treatment or not. So this is the Canadian Community Health Survey, and it is an epidemiologic study that represents, not every single Canadian was interviewed for this study, but on the basis of households, postal codes, demographic and racial and ethnic and sex-related difference characteristics, this group of people represents Canada. So we can conclude, despite the fact that it's not all Canadians, that this would represent the whole country. What you see in this study from the teens that have bipolar disorder, and this study was undertaken by a resident at the time, Nicole Kozloff, who was working with Dr. Amy Chung here at Sunnybrook, you see the same types of themes you've been hearing about. Look at the column of 15 to 18 years old. This is a general population sample, not people coming to our emergency department. And as you can see, despite this young age, high rates of anxiety disorders, high rates of substance abuse, high rates of suicidality. And you would think to yourself, wow, they must be absolutely filling up the healthcare system. No, over 50% of them have never had any sort of psychiatric treatment, let alone treatment for their bipolar disorder. So we have to hold that in mind when we think about overdiagnosis, is the fact that this is the reality in youth, as it is in adults, in Canada and the U.S. and other places, is that people have these severe medical conditions accompanied by multiple other dangerous and severe medical conditions, and they're not getting treatment. And I think that, again, we can speculate why is that. But one of the reasons I think few of us would doubt is still residual stigma. And I think that is another important aspect of research and of these types of conversations, that we really need to bring down the shame so that when we do this study in 15 years, the people with bipolar disorder will not have 50% of them with suicidality, right? That we're going to be able to preempt that. Not necessarily fully prevent bipolar disorder, but prevent these pernicious forms of the disease that by the age of 15, 16 years old are already in full form. Can people see that from the back? This is a sheet of paper that a patient's parents brought into my clinic because they had fished it out of the garbage can when they were concerned about their daughter. And I'll read to you here. So what the title is What's Wrong with My Life? And the list reads: anxiety, ADHD, bipolar, anger issues, depression, addicted to weed, snort pills, cut myself, panic attacks, wanting to not wake up. And why do I put that in this slide when you've already seen that in so many other ways? It's because this is not invented by data or by research. This is the lived experience of, at the time, a 14-year-old girl. And the reason that I present this when I'm teaching residents or medical students is we don't invent complexity. It's not because we're confused or because we're not asking the right questions. It's because when the door opens, a young person walks in and this is their reality. And if you need it neat and clean, and if you need it absolutely crystal clear, and if you have black and white thinking that suggests you either have one condition or the other, you're going to miss the boat, and you're going to fail the needs of that individual. So we have to have a strategy to deal with the fact that this is how people are walking through the door. And as you heard from Dr. Mitchell, multimodal, long-term, personalized, and essentially, each individual clinical scenario is different, but starting with life or death, and then suffering, and then functioning, and then getting to the point of satisfaction. And this is one of the things I think that brings a lot of us who enjoy treating people and families affected by bipolar disorder, is that it's very realistic to maintain the ultimate goal that somebody's completely well with no evidence of activity of that condition in their life. It's not to say that they don't have to have treatment, but that riding on the bus beside them, seeing them in school or at work, that you would see no sign of this. And for me, this is one of the motivating goals, is to have, that's not always going to be the case, but the fact that you can reach that with some people is really what drives us. And we'd like to move, probably 1/3 or a quarter of people would fall in that group right now. I hope that by the end of my career, and in our lifetimes, that we see a higher percentage of people that can have bipolar disorder, but it's not this severe, early onset, very, very complicated. We've seen progress like this in heart disease. We've seen progress like this in cancer. And I think there's no reason to expect that bipolar disorder would be any different. I won't belabor the point, but again, just to show some information about the first 100 patients, we bring together research and clinical care together. So people that have assessments have the opportunity, if they want to, separate their personal identifying information, and we put the other information into a data set. We get descriptive information. As you can see here, on average, there's a 2-to-1 ratio of girls to boys, which is fascinating and neglected. And hopefully in the years ahead, you'll hear again from Dr. Mitchell. And one of her research interests is to try to better understand, we don't see this in adults. Why is there 2-to-1 females to males? We don't have a good understanding of that. What's the difference of manifestations of bipolar disorder in a teenage girl versus a teenage boy? We don't have a good understanding of that, and it may help us target treatments to be more personalized and then hopefully more rapidly effective. BD subtype, so you heard type 1, that's characterized by severe episodes of mania, usually alternating with depression. Type 2 is what we call hypomanic episodes, same exact symptoms. You would notice the functional changes. The person would either be an exaggeratedly good version of themselves or slightly impaired. But if you're really impaired, we call that bipolar 1 disorder or mania. And then not otherwise specified, which has another whole long acronym that I won't expose you to this evening because you've heard enough acronyms, is the idea of a spectrum. So what happens if you're not, quote unquote, cooperating and you don't have 4 full days of hypomania, but you have 2 days, or you've multiple times in your life had 1 day? If you call that just regular depression, you may be making a mistake. And so we have to be able to embrace the fact that there is a bit of a spectrum. It has its limits, but we think that it's below 4 days. And then the other characteristics you see here very, very briefly is the fact that this is a complicated illness, even among people the first day they come into our clinic. Okay. One of the things in terms of communicating to you and making explicit to you how we reach a diagnosis of bipolar disorder is how we manage symptoms, as you heard from Dr. Mitchell, that overlap among different conditions. And so what I want to do is spend a couple of minutes just showing to you how we might approach a symptom that's present in depression, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder. So let's take, how's the font? Can people in the back see it okay? Okay. So elation. What's the difference? Elation, abnormal happiness, silliness. You see, this is a diagnostic criterion for mania or hypomania. But you can also see it in a kid with ADHD who's really hyped up and out of proportion silly. But in a kid with ADHD or a teen with ADHD, if it's present, it's not clearly going to be pathological. It may or may not be episodic, but it's not going to track along with a whole bunch of buddies, which are these other symptoms together that you saw in that slide. Fast thinking, fast speaking, distractibility, less need for sleep. And so it's very, very key that this elation is not a lone ranger, but that it goes along with these other symptoms. And that helps make sure that we're attributing that symptom to the right condition. Irritability. In bipolar disorder, you'll see this. If it's characteristic of a person's manic or hypomanic episode, it's going to be days, not minutes. Days, not an hour or two. You can see it associated with ADHD, especially if somebody's on a stimulant medication for their ADHD, and at the end of the day it starts wearing off. You can see some irritability come out. That characteristic timing is suggestive of the fact that it's probably not by itself a mood disorder. In oppositional defiant disorder, again, it's chronic and it doesn't travel in episodes. It can have waxing and waning, but it doesn't go on and off, so to speak, and it doesn't hang out with other symptoms. Sleep is a fairly easy one when it comes to mania. There is no other diagnosis in our diagnostic book in which you lose your need for sleep. If you have anxiety, you can have insomnia. You're lying in bed, you're thinking, you're tense, you can't sleep, you get 2 or 3 hours. When you wake up in the morning, that teenager is going to feel miserable. And if they feel okay at 9 or 10, they're going to get to lunch hour and they're going to be with their head on their desk. If you have that same type of night because you're hyped up and you're in the kitchen cooking something, or you're in the garage building something that you came up with a fantastic idea, and the next day you're fine at 6 p.m., that is something that's reduced need for sleep, and that's very unique to bipolar disorder or to mania or hypomania. Grandiosity. So if somebody has an exaggerated sense of themselves as an individual, and that's an attribute of their personality, you're going to see that most of the time in most different settings. If you're not that sort of person, and then all of a sudden when you have these periods of elation or irritability, all of a sudden become excessively confident, excessively optimistic about different ideas that you may have, and that grandiosity, that excessive confidence affects your judgment, that's when you start looking at it as a symptom of mania. So the one comment I have to make, and I'll just skip to this slide to show it to you, is when you have something like ADHD, for example, you'll have a kid or a teen who's, by definition of having their ADHD, they're distractible, they're hyper, they may chat a lot, and that is not always a monotone. You can have worse days or better days, but it's going to be present every day. What you'll have to see to diagnose a bipolar disorder over and above that is a difference. So taking into account the fact that ADHD is better or worse on certain days, you have to be able to convince yourself, in my case as a psychiatrist, in other people's case as a parent or as a teenager themselves, that attentional difficulty or that hyperactivity is beyond their ADHD. This is their ADHD on turbo. This is something else, and again, accompanied by other symptoms. What difference does it make in terms of diagnosis and in terms of treatment? So for ADHD, there's a lot of overlapping symptoms. I just mentioned them: hyperactivity, distractibility, talking a lot. And so you have to be able to make sure that you're looking for episodes and that you're distinguishing. Don't double count it automatically. Just because someone's distracted, you don't give them distractibility or attention problems are also characteristic not only of ADHD or mania, but also of generalized anxiety. When people are worrying, they can't pay attention. So you want to try to pick what you're going to attribute it to. In terms of treatment implications, if a person, you've done your careful assessment, and they have both bipolar disorder and ADHD, what we know is you want to stabilize their bipolar disorder first, because if you just gave them a stimulant medication like Ritalin or Concerta, you may destabilize their mood. Once their mood is stable, it's safe for the vast majority of patients to try to treat the ADHD as you would if they didn't have bipolar disorder. And we have high-quality studies to show that you can treat both effectively. Oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder, these are diagnoses characterized, the former by defiance, by being headstrong, by being irritable, and then conduct disorders when it gets into violating laws and rules and responsibilities and societal norms, like stealing and setting fires and that sort of thing. There are some overlapping symptoms. I think the main difference with these behavioral disorders is that in the absence of a behavioral treatment, you're unlikely to get a lot of traction. You really have to have therapy as part of oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder. Combining psychological treatments or therapies with bipolar disorder is often needed, not always. I would say that for these disruptive behavior disorders, really going to be hard to make any traction without therapy. Anxiety disorders, you have some overlapping symptoms. I've personally been in a situation where I really couldn't tell if somebody had a very, very tense and restless generalized anxiety because they were thinking a lot, they were thinking fast, they were describing their worries quickly, they felt restless and a nervous tension, they were distractible. These are all overlapping symptoms of hypomania as well, so it can be tough to distinguish the two. The treatment implications are that you generally want to target anxiety. When it comes to therapy, therapy doesn't care too much whether your anxiety is a part of a bipolar disorder comorbidity or just the anxiety. We're still targeting what's called CBT, so looking at thoughts people have and emotions they have in response to those thoughts when they experience different life events. And CBT is the type of thing you'd want to do for anxiety in bipolar disorder as you would in anxiety disorders without bipolar disorder. You want to be super careful with antidepressants. So we use a class of antidepressants in teenagers called SSRIs. They're very safe for the vast majority of teens with depression and anxiety, but if you have a bipolar disorder, they can potentially trigger what's called a treatment-emergent mania, and you heard about examples of that earlier and what it does to people's lives. And we have to balance. We don't want to treat everybody as if they have bipolar disorder, but we also don't want to be putting people in hospital because we've tried to make them better. You can understand the tension in that as a clinician. So we really have to be judicious with that and usually start with a mood-stabilizing medication and also, as I mentioned, integrating CBT. Eating disorders don't really confuse the diagnostic picture too much. Anorexia nervosa, people stop eating, have an excessively negative view of their body image, excessively value thinness at the expense of other things in their life. That doesn't overlap too much with mania. Depression, potentially, but anorexia, significant weight loss, in the absence necessarily of a lot of sadness is often not a super difficult diagnosis to make. It's a hard one to satisfy because you have to have such an effect on your life. The one that overlaps more with mood disorders is bulimia. So people that have a lot of impulsivity, part of which is to overeat and then undereat, do compensatory things like make themselves sick or take medicines to lose weight. And for those, we can see that people are doing the binging in response to a shifted mood. It could be anxiety. It could be the fact that they get excited and just want something rewarding. So some people turn to substances, other people turn to risky behaviors or increased sexual activities, others will excessively eat, and we have to get an understanding of why a binge is happening for that individual. In terms of treatment implications, we want to try to not make weight an issue with especially the medications that we're using. And so if somebody has a history of an eating disorder, we have to be really cautious about preparing them for the possibility that they may gain some weight, trying to prevent that from the gate rather than waiting until there's been a weight gain. Because if you have a teenager with bulimia and they put on 15 pounds from your medicine and they feel like they don't have control of their weight, they're going to turn to maladaptive coping strategies. If we can try to prevent that and try to minimize the weight gain, we may be able to work with them to use more adaptive coping strategies like healthy nutrition, exercise, and sleep. The other thing that we try to do with mood disorders is if somebody's bulimia is characterized by a lot of impulsivity, so mood-related binges, which is really commonly the case, if we can help reduce their impulsivity, we may indirectly benefit their bulimia. And then finally, substance use disorders. So most commonly cannabis, then alcohol, and then less commonly harder drugs, although with significant opiates and over-the-counters and availability, as you've probably been reading about in the press, especially in the States, harder drugs are also a concern. If people are intoxicated, they can look at their manic. Vice versa, you also heard about people that are manic and are mistaken for being intoxicated. The main influence that has is that we don't diagnose bipolar disorder if somebody's only manic while they're under the influence of something like cocaine. But if somebody smokes a little bit of cannabis and 2 weeks later they're still completely manic, we do not withhold the diagnosis of bipolar disorder. We say that was too small a push to cause the rolling that happened afterward. And so in our current diagnostic manual, if a small trigger, like a little bit of marijuana, causes a full manic episode that someone's still sick in hospital weeks later, we will diagnose bipolar disorder. In terms of treatment implications, you have to bring these things together. We used to have the concept that if you have an addiction and a mood disorder, if you went to the addiction treatment door, they'd say, for you to embrace the change that you need to, you got to get that mood disorder treated, come back to us when you're ready. And then if you ended up in the mood clinic, they'd say, look, our medicines aren't going to be effective if you're drinking that much. Come back to us when you're sober. And now we recognize that you really have to embrace the two together. The one exception is in situations in which one of the conditions is life-threatening. So if somebody's psychotically manic, you're likely to put the bipolar disorder first. If somebody's using heroin daily, you're likely going to put that first. But most of the time, that's not the scenario that we're faced with, and we're able to do an integrated intervention. So with the second part of the presentation, I want to talk about the concept of heart disease, which is an area of focus for the Center for Youth Bipolar Disorder, and you may ask yourself why, and what I hope is over the next few slides you'll understand. Bipolar disorder confers a risk of highly premature heart disease, so up to 17 years earlier for people with bipolar disorder type 1. This is a larger difference than you see even for major depression. We had success earlier in the year of collaborating as part of work with the American Heart Association of establishing the fact worldwide that major depression and bipolar disorder in teenagers are conditions that, like some other conditions like rheumatoid arthritis or HIV, independently confer risk for higher rates of heart disease. And this is a big deal for a number of reasons. If you care about heart outcomes in midlife, this is good because it's going to get pediatricians and family doctors looking at cardiovascular risk when someone's 15 or 16. If you care about stigma, it's putting bipolar disorder along medical conditions like HIV, like inflammatory arthritis, and I think that although that wasn't the primary intention of this work, I think that's another advantage of embracing the brain and body perspectives of bipolar disorder. So what are the reasons for this high rate of heart disease and the prematurity of the heart disease? One is that there might be shared biology. The concept here that I'll highlight is the concept you may have heard about, inflammation. This is part of the body's immune system and defense mechanism. If you get a cut, if you get an infection, your quickest reaction is immune response, inflammation. And when people are depressed, they also have the same type of response. And repeatedly over time, this confers risk for heart disease. The other factor is behavior and environment. People with bipolar disorder, like other major mental illnesses, have lives that are characterized by a lot of stress. And not only from the symptoms, but from the endpoints of what happens from those symptoms. If you've spent your whole bank account, if you've crashed your car, if you've been arrested, that effect on you in relation to stress lasts well beyond when the episode has ended. And then we know for a fact already from data that we have that nutrition on average, exercise on average, sleep routines on average are less optimal among people with bipolar disorder than those without. And then finally, we have to acknowledge the possibility that medications are part of this. What I'll say is that most antidepressants don't have large effects on weight or cardiovascular risk factors. But some of the medications that we use, like antipsychotics or lithium, do cause weight gain. Some also cause changes in blood sugar. What I'll say is that it's very clear that any relationship between bipolar disorder or major depression and heart disease is over and above what we can explain by these regular heart risk factors. So it's not just the fact of having more type 2 diabetes. It's not just the fact of having more obesity and blood pressure. There's something special linking these mood disorders and heart disease, and it's that difference, those special aspects that are yet unknown that we hope to focus on because we think they'll give us some insights about what causes bipolar disorder. Why should you care as a person living with or knowing someone affected by bipolar disorder? The reason is that if you have cardiovascular risk factors like obesity or diabetes, you tend to have a worse type of bipolar disorder that's less responsive to treatment. And we don't know right now which way does it go. Is it the case that those who are predisposed towards heart disease inherently have a worse condition of bipolar disorder? Is it that the worst bipolar disorder is so stressful? It's probably both, but we really need to get more understanding from what we call longitudinal data, so studies that track people over time. A quick note to point out, we looked recently at our teens. This is over 100 teens with bipolar disorder compared to those without major mood disorders. And what you see is 3 types of physical activity. Sedentary behavior, you're asked as a healthy living Canadian to not sit on a couch or a chair in front of a television or a computer screen more than 2 hours a day. As you can see here, about 33% of people meet that goal. Most of us are sitting in front of a screen much longer. But there was no difference between teens with bipolar disorder and without with regard to how sedentary they were. Similarly, we're advised to spend at least an hour every day doing incidental physical activity, or what's called working in. Walking, gardening, ironing, things that you're moving about, but you're not necessarily breaking a sweat or breathing hard. And as you can see here, only 50% of the teens in the study met this threshold, but there was no difference in bipolar disorder and not. Where we do see the difference is in aerobics. So when it comes to working out vigorously, rates are low. You can see here even the healthy teens, just about a quarter of them are meeting the 4 times a week of half an hour or more, but less than 5% of teens with bipolar disorder. So here you have this setup where you have this activity, aerobic exercise, which could be good for your cognition, could be good for your heart, could be good for your mood, and it's really being participated in at a very, very low rate. We have to get a better understanding about what the barriers are at the individual level so that we can get people moving more. Not just for people with bipolar disorder, but in particular for people with bipolar disorder. Andrew mentioned graphs. I'm going to present some graphs, but I hope to distill for you why they're interesting or why you may find them interesting. This is work by Jessica Hatch, who's a PhD student working with us. And what she did was she looked at one of the leading biomarkers related to bipolar disorder, which is called, we'll call it LPH. It's a marker of oxidative stress. So when your body processes energy, metabolism, it can produce negative byproducts that are toxic. And so we looked at this marker, which is linked with bipolar disorder, and what she did was compare it to a proxy measure of vascular problems. So you can look with an ultrasound in the carotid artery in the neck, and depending on how thick the wall of it is, you can see how likely that person is to go on to develop heart disease in the future. This is the closest we can get. We don't put catheters in people who are 15 or 16 years old because there's not a clinical implication. This is a research measure, but it's as close as we can get to saying this person's at risk for heart disease. And what you can see here is a very strong relationship. You know, we've drawn the line through this to represent the average relationship, but you can just see from the scatter of the points a strong relationship between this biomarker typical of bipolar disorder with this marker of early vascular risk. Question arising, if we modify this biomarker, can we shift this relationship? Other question arising, if we modify cardiovascular risk, can we reduce the symptoms of bipolar disorder? This is the type of thinking that we hope to move towards. Another study I'll just briefly mention is from Melanie Neiberg, also a PhD student working with us. And what she looked at was 2 types of cognition. I'll just very briefly go through these. One is related to cognitive flexibility. So in real life, when people are faced with someone who's frustrated with them or with an obstacle, they can try one thing, maybe 2, 3 times. If it doesn't work, they should try something else. And that's adaptive flexibility. It's well known that people with bipolar disorder, as well as those who are family members of theirs who are unaffected by bipolar disorder, have deficits. They're cognitively less flexible. So they don't shift sets. When the rules would suggest time to try a different gear, it takes them longer to make that decision. And so what we looked at was, how does that cognitive flexibility map onto cardiovascular risk? And what you can see here is the triglycerides. So this is a type of, quote, bad cholesterol that's measurable very easily at any hospital, are strongly associated with cognitive inflexibility, even when you control for the fact that they're taking medications and their IQ and their age. And so this is very interesting. Again, it's a cross-sectional finding, but it raises the question, can we look to a whole other branch of treatments that try to reduce triglycerides with the purpose of improving executive function or cognitive flexibility? What you see here in blue, I'll walk you through it here. In blue is the relationship between triglycerides and cognitive flexibility. You can see that the line is flat. There's no meaningful relationship. In green, what you see is the relationship in teens with bipolar disorder. What you can see is that the line is slanted. The worse your triglycerides, the worse your cognitive flexibility. So again, this becomes very interesting. Why are we seeing a relationship? How does this slide know who has bipolar disorder? And so the question is it the case that you need 2 hits in order to see this relationship? The first hit being the triglycerides, bipolar disorder, and then it's the combination of the two where you see this relationship. And so two implications, again, the link between treating people to being heart healthy as affecting their cognition, and also the fact that we're seeing a difference biologically between teens with and without bipolar disorder, which I would argue is something that can be destigmatizing. It's not to say that we can use triglycerides to test for bipolar disorder, but this moves us closer to shifting certain skeptics who are not convinced by the suffering and disability of mood disorders. And I think that a lot of us in the room might say, we don't really get why you need to have a biomarker, but for those, I think, who still have stigma, this is something that can bring them into the tent. I'm going to skip this slide for the purpose of time. And so what we want to move towards is looking at research that emphasizes integration of care. You heard about the integration of substance abuse and bipolar disorder. What about heart health and mood health? We have colleagues working with the elderly adults who have had heart attacks, looking at cardiac rehab. That's obvious. You have to look at brain health and heart health. We don't think of it so much in teenagers. And I think we need to move towards it and getting in really early and not having it be, well, take this medication, see your therapist, and also you kind of sort of should have a good healthy lifestyle. We really need to hold that third recommendation to the same level of rigor, both in terms of the research that we're using to make that suggestion. I don't suggest CBT because I think it kind of sort of works. I suggest CBT because the best clinical trials that medicine and psychology have to offer have shown that it's better than just talking to somebody. I don't prescribe medicines because I think it might work. I think it's because we have high quality evidence. And it's because of that I'm confident prescribing something that may even have side effects. And the same is true for exercise. We really need to get an understanding of whom we should be targeting with exercise, when, with what type, with what dose, so that people are not having aversive experiences. If you just tell someone, hey, you have bipolar disorder, I heard that you're at risk for heart disease, you need to go start meeting Healthy Canada guidelines 4 to 5 days a week, 45 minutes at a time, get going, that person's not going to have a good week. And they're probably not going to do exercise for a long time if that's what they jump to. And so we need to get an understanding of how individual differences in fitness, in emotional response to exercise, weave into the decisions that we make and the recommendations that we make. So to summarize the heart-mood link, if we reduce cardiovascular risk factors, we could not only improve cardiovascular outcomes, but improve the things that are bothering teenagers right now, which is their cognition and their mood. We could look at new treatment targets. So in addition to asking someone, how's the last month been, or have you used your mood app, we can also look at new treatment targets like their cardiovascular risk factors. So moving towards saying, someone isn't really treatment resistant until they're treatment resistant and heart healthy. And until then, the onus is on the collaboration of families, patients, and treatment providers to make sure that person is moved along the heart health ladder towards good health, and then the medicines may be more likely to render their benefits. And I think that what's nice about this approach is, first of all, it can start any day with no cost. It's a matter of just starting to pay more attention to heart-healthy living. It's something that brings us all together with shared purpose, policymakers, people that help reduce barriers to getting gym memberships, getting families moving together, trying to get a sense of what the lived experience is of exercise and how that might affect how we choose to study it. And again, I think I've made the point that I think that there's benefits to be offered as it relates to reducing stigma. So last slide is that bipolar disorder in teenagers is often complex, and we should recognize the fact that it's complex in our assessment and treatment and not try to be cute or to be simple or simplistic. We have to integrate psychiatric comorbidities into our clinical approaches. We cannot just focus on one thing. We have to have a hierarchy of things, but definitely recognize that everything is on that list and we need to get to everything. We can't just rest when people are no longer depressed. We have to get to their ADHD or their cognitive dysfunction. We have to get to treating that anxiety to being absent or minimal. Otherwise, we have high risk of people having recurrences. We know that teens with bipolar disorder are increased risk for heart disease, and I think that the take-home message is that we need to have a paradigm shift. We have had a paradigm shift between mind and brain dichotomy, recognizing there's an integration. And the next step, I think, in the decade ahead of us, even in young people, is to bring heart into that picture with all of the potential advantages it has for research, for clinical care, for stigma reduction. So I wanted to acknowledge a number of collaborators. We have the great good fortune here at Sunnybrook of being able to collaborate with adult radiologists and adult ophthalmologists, even anesthesiologists, cardiologists, and all of whom are spending some of their time giving some thought to adolescent bipolar disorder, which I have to say has been a really rewarding experience. Funding organizations in Canada, philanthropically, and from the government and from foundations. And then finally recognize the tremendous amount of work that goes in from our graduate students, from our research assistants. What you see here on this picture, hopefully, is what I call intellectual capital. The hope is that a generation from now, we have dozens and hundreds more people whose work is going into this, who are all dialed into this the same way we had people in the past focus on, curing cancer and that sort of thing, that we have a groundswell of smart, driven people so that we can really kind of change how the game is currently. So with that, I wanted to really thank you for your attention, for coming out tonight. Invite you to please stay around, mingle with us, talk to people with our posters, ask questions about why it matters and what it means, and please continue to join us. Share with us your feedback of the evening, ideas that you have for future years, and thank you very much. So with that, we'll conclude, and let's just hang out at the back of the room.